On the morning of August 13, 2018, in Frederick, Colorado, Shanann Watts and her daughters, Bella and Celeste, didn't just go missing. They vanished without her car, without her phone, without any sign she'd planned to disappear. A friend told police she dropped Shanann at home around 1:48 a.m. after a business trip. Investigators would later note Shanann was about 15 weeks pregnant. By late morning, she wasn't answering calls or texts, and she'd missed a scheduled doctor's appointment. The friend drove back to the house and found Shanann's vehicle still in the garage. Frederick police were sent to the home for a welfare check. When Shanann's husband, Chris Watts, arrived, officers entered with his consent and began looking for anything that could explain an absence that already felt wrong. Inside, investigators noted personal belongings that, in their experience, people don't usually abandon on an ordinary day. Her phone, her purse, her medication. The family's life was here, but the family wasn't. Chris told officers he'd seen Shanann earlier that morning. He said he left for work before sunrise, believing she was still home. It was a story that sounded simple, until the neighborhood itself offered a timeline. A nearby security camera captured Chris backing his truck up to the garage and leaving at about 5:27 a.m. In a case where minutes would soon matter, that single movement became a hinge point. Because if your family is inside, why position a truck at the garage door before dawn? The call came in as a check of well-being, but it didn't feel routine for long. The front door wouldn't open fully because a latch held it in place, and an officer checked the home's doors and windows. Locked, no easy way in. When Chris Watts was reached, he said he was only minutes away and provided consent for police to enter once he arrived. Inside, the absence was loud. Shanann's car was still there. Her personal effects, items most people don't leave behind if they're storming out or starting over, were located in the house, along with medication. A suitcase sat at the bottom of the stairs. Shoes were near the front door. The master bed had been stripped, the bedding left on the floor, and officers checked it for signs of foul play, but noted nothing obvious in that moment. Then, Chris began narrating time like it could save him. He told police Shanann returned around 2 a.m. He said he woke around 5 a.m., talked about separation, and insisted it stayed. A civil, even if both were emotional. He said he backed his truck up to the garage around 5:27 a.m. to load tools and left for work, while Shanann, he claimed, was still in bed. But the day had witnesses that didn't argue back. A neighbor's surveillance system captured key time stamps, Nicole's vehicle leaving after the late-night drop-off, and Chris's truck backing into the driveway before dawn. And once detectives asked to see that footage, the case stopped being a missing family and started becoming a timeline with nowhere to hide. By mid-afternoon, the investigation had something it could measure: time. Chris Watts had told officers Shanann came home around 2 a.m. and that he left for work a little after 5. Then, as detectives pressed for specifics, the story shifted tighter. Now, he placed her arrival at about 1:48 a.m. and described a separation talk around 4 a.m., both of them upset and crying. Those details mattered because the house wasn't giving up an explanation. So detectives started building one from what people could prove. A neighbor's home surveillance system had captured the night in fragments, the vehicle leaving after Shanann was dropped off, and, hours later, Chris backing his work truck into the driveway at about 5:27 a.m., then pulling away a short time after. No images of Shanann walking out. No children visible. Just the truck before dawn, positioned close to the garage in a way that made investigators look twice. Inside the home, detectives documented the quiet, inconsistencies. Shanann's phone was located in the house, and Chris surrendered it for examination. Her purse and medication were there. A suitcase sat downstairs. In the master bedroom, the bedding had been stripped and left on the floor. None of it proved a crime on its own, yet all of it argued against an ordinary disappearance. That evening, patrol officers and detectives canvassed the neighborhood for hours, and a "be on the lookout" went out through dispatch. And by the next morning, when no one had come back and no credible sightings had surfaced, detectives escalated fast, requesting broader assistance and a public alert, because this was no longer just a missing family. What exactly had happened in the narrow window between 1:48 a.m. and 5:27 a.m.? By Tuesday, August 14th, the search had moved beyond the walls of Saratoga Trail. Colorado authorities issued an endangered missing alert for Shanann Watts and her daughters, Bella and Celeste, an escalation that quietly admits what everyone fears. Adults can choose to disappear, but little kids don't vanish on purpose. And still, nothing came back. No verified sightings. No credible call that put Shanann or the girls anywhere else. Because the problem wasn't only that they were missing. It was that their last known starting point was a house still holding the essentials of daily life. As the case went public, Chris Watts stepped into that spotlight. In interviews with local media, he asked for their return and told reporters he'd had an emotional conversation with Shanann the night before. In one plea, he repeated a simple line, "I just want them back," as if saying it enough times could make it true. Behind the scenes, the search widened again. Reports noted the FBI and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation joining efforts as investigators continued working the disappearance as an urgent missing family case. But the public heard hope, while detectives heard deadlines. Every hour without proof of life tightened the focus to what could be documented. That pre-dawn truck movement, that locked-up house, and the only adult who could explain the gap, yet kept speaking in careful, shifting time. Because once a missing person case becomes a clock, the next question is always the same. When do police stop asking for help and start asking for the truth? By the morning of August 14th, there was still no verified trace of Shanann Watts or her daughters. Detectives pushed for an immediate press release and requested help from state and federal partners, because the longer this stayed missing, the harder it would be to pull back. Chris Watts kept offering a simple explanation. Shanann had come home in the early hours. They'd talked about separating, and later that day she was going to a friend's house with the girls. But when police asked the kind of question that should be easy, who was the friend? He couldn't give them a name. That night, at 7:08 p.m., Chris sat down at the Frederick Police Department with an FBI agent who worked missing children cases. The agent told him they were going to ask endless questions again and again, because details are what rescue children, and because memories decay fast, so the questions got small on purpose. What was your routine? What did you eat? Chris mentioned tracking food with an app, like Control, could be measured in calories. Then the interview tightened around the house itself. The agent asked about the shoes by the door, the car still in the garage, the things left behind, and he put the fear into one clean sentence. Investigators were trying to figure out whether Shanann walked out or whether she was taken out. Chris said he understood. He answered anyway. He stayed in the chair. Because the next request wouldn't be about memory at all. It would be about deception. 2 days in, investigators had learned something Chris Watts had denied earlier. He was in an affair with a co-worker. It didn't prove murder, but it handed detectives a motive for deception and a reason to press harder. On August 15th, Chris agreed to a polygraph administered by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation at the Frederick Police Department. He consented on record. He answered questions about whether he knew where Shanann and the girls were, and whether he had harmed them. When it ended, the agent told him the results showed deception. He didn't leave, he didn't stop talking. Instead, he asked for a private conversation with his father, who was waiting inside the building. After that, investigators recorded Chris saying he would tell the truth. What followed was a confession, but it arrived wrapped in an accusation. Chris admitted killing Shanann and claimed it happened after he said he saw Shanann strangling one of their daughters. Detectives documented the statement as he gave it, even as it left a raw, unresolved question hanging in the air. In the moments that followed, what did Chris do, and what did he choose not to do? Comment, Shanann, if you believe in justice and awareness. Earlier that same day, with Chris's consent, investigators had already gone to the remote oil site where he worked, launching a drone search across the tank battery area. They spotted a bedsheet in a field and fresh movement of dirt consistent with a clandestine grave. What exactly was waiting at that site? Within hours of Chris Watts failing the polygraph, investigators were no longer searching the neighborhood for a missing family. They were driving east into the open industrial quiet of his work route, because Chris had finally given them a location. At the oil site where he'd reported that morning, agents and officers began scanning the ground. A sheet lay out in the field, visible from above. Nearby, they saw disturbed earth, fresh enough to read as recent. In a case built on minutes, this wasn't a clue. It was an endpoint. Chris had told investigators he buried Shanann in a shallow grave at the site. He also admitted the girls were not coming home. Authorities moved with the urgency of confirmation. Careful documentation, controlled steps, the grim discipline of recovery. When Shanann's body was located, the disappearance collapsed into a homicide investigation in a single, irreversible moment. Chris was taken into custody. The story he'd sold, an emotional separation talk, a wife who left with the children, couldn't survive contact with the ground. But the worst part wasn't finished because the site held more than one secret. Investigators searched the tank battery area, structures that don't belong in anyone's family life, but do belong in a working man's routine. And what detectives were about to find would not only confirm the deaths of Bella and Celeste, it would define the cruelty of how they were concealed. Because once the recovery began, the next question turned brutal and unavoidable. Where exactly were the girls? By Thursday, August 16th, the missing label finally broke. At a news conference, Colorado Bureau of Investigation Director John Camper told reporters that investigators had located Shanann Watts' body on an oil and gas property tied to Chris Watts' work, and the teams were still working to recover what they believed were the bodies of Bella and Celeste. Those weren't the words of a search anymore. They were the words of a homicide scene still in progress. Chris had been arrested the night before. Now, in court, he appeared in custody, while prosecutors described the case in the cold language of charges, not hope. He was ordered held without bond, and the story he'd repeated on camera, a wife who left with the kids, collapsed under the weight of what investigators were finding in the field. In the days that followed, the paperwork caught up to the reality. Court filings in Weld County laid out 9 felony counts, including multiple counts of first-degree murder, unlawful termination of pregnancy, and tampering with a deceased human body. Each count was a formal declaration that this wasn't a disappearance to be solved, it was a family erased. And with that, the investigation's focus shifted from "where are they?" to "how do we prove it?" Detectives would now have to translate a confession into evidence that could survive open court under oath, with every claim tested. Would Chris Watts make the state prove its case to a jury, or admit what he'd done before the evidence ever reached trial? For weeks after the arrests, the case sat in an in-between place. officially charged, publicly infamous, but not yet tested in open court. Prosecutors filed a stack of felony counts that, if this went to trial, would have forced every step of that August timeline into the harsh light of sworn testimony. Then, on November 6, 2018, Chris Watts walked into a Weld County courtroom and ended the question of whether there would be a trial at all. He pleaded guilty, again and again, to killing Shanann Watts and their daughters, Bella and Celeste. He also pleaded guilty to unlawfully terminating Shanann's pregnancy, and he admitted to the charges tied to what prosecutors said he did afterward, crimes that exist because people sometimes try to hide what they've done rather than face it. The agreement did something else too. It removed the death penalty as a possible outcome. No jury selection, no opening statements, no defense narrative built to create doubt. Just a sequence of guilty answers that locked his responsibility into the official record. But a guilty plea is not closure, it's a narrowing. The court still had to decide punishment. The family still had to prepare to speak in the same room as the man who had just admitted out loud that he took everything from them. And on sentencing day, the court would decide how many life sentences his one-word plea would become. On November 19, 2018, in the Weld County Courthouse in Greeley, the case stopped being a headline and became a permanent sentence. Judge Marcelo Kopkow said the crime was among the most inhumane and vicious he'd seen from the bench. Then he imposed what Colorado law demands once first-degree murder is established: life without the possibility of parole. Chris Watts received 5 life sentences, with 3 ordered to run consecutively, plus another 84 years for the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy and 3 tampering counts. The plea deal had removed the death penalty from the table, a decision the Weld County District Attorney said was made with the victim's family's agreement. But in that courtroom, no agreement could soften what came next. The family's words? Shanann's father called Watts an evil monster. Her mother told the court she had asked prosecutors not to pursue execution, saying it wasn't her right to take another life, then spoke about a daughter who loved deeply and children who trusted completely. Watts didn't give a full statement. His attorney offered a brief apology on his behalf, acknowledging that words are hollow. And that's the haunting truth of the official record. Guilt was resolved, punishment was fixed, but the why still sits in the empty spaces between facts, spaces no sentence can fill. Because when a friend sounds the alarm and the evidence starts a clock, the only question left is how many other disappearances never get that first urgent call.